respects and honors the land on which we are standing as never having been ceded to us. Okay, so as you all well know, Ashoka's goal is really to create a world, and as the Ashoka folks say, everyone is a change maker. And this means both finding a world where all citizens can find their own power and contribute to change in positive ways. And each of you who are Ashoka Fellows not only know this, but have done this and continue to do this. So I'm very pleased to hear about the activities that are going on this year so that you can actually reconnect with Ashoka Fellows and have regional meetings and events like this one tonight. It's a very exciting time for you to be on the New School campus. The New School is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. So yeah, I'm 100, look at that, exciting. I look good for 100, don't I? The New School was founded in 1919, which, as you may know, was a complicated time in the world. It was a time of rising global fascism. It was a difficult war period in the world. It was the summer that was called in the U.S. the Red Summer, where there were a large number of African Americans who were killed after returning from war service, many of them. And it was a difficult cultural and political time. It was also a time when higher education was under attack, and the founders of the New School, who came from what they refer to as the old school, Columbia University, no offense, to found a new kind of university that was predicated on positive social change, on lifelong learning, and really thought that scholarship should be animated towards active action in the world. And I think that's very much consistent with the Ashoka approach. And so this approach began 100 years ago and is still very much in play today in all of our activities. This year, as part of our celebration in the fall, we will be holding a week-long festival to which we invite all of you to participate. So from October 1st to October 6th, we will open the doors of the campus. You can take classes, you can participate in activities and events. We'll have things ranging from, speakers and other kinds of activities. We've rented out Union Square for a concert with Lion Babe, who is an alum of the New School, and other kinds of activities. No wooing for Lion Babe, so I read the audience there. So we will have a whole week-long series of events and activities, and we invite you to join us during that time period. So as we look forward to the next 100 years, what we know for sure is that climate change is arguably the most pressing issue of our time. And because we care about those who are the most vulnerable among us, we also know that climate change will affect those communities more than the other communities first. And so this really speaks to the imperative for finding solutions in the climate change space. We believe, some of us believe, that we have the technology, and what we really need is the social interventions, because there are technological solutions that are required, but a social and political import is also essential. And so at the New School, we have Tishman Environment and Design Center, which we call TEDC, which is working on issues of climate change, but specifically through the lens of environmental justice, very much focusing on the most vulnerable among us. And among our initiatives in the Tishman Center is to find ways that all 14,000 members of our community, our 10,000 students, staff, and others, are mobilized to have impact on climate change. This last thing I'll mention in closing is that I've been affiliated with working with Ashoka activities for about a decade now, and my colleague Michelle Kahana, who has also been associated with Ashoka and Ashoka U for many years, have been working on a new initiative which we call the Impact Entrepreneurship Initiative. So this past year, we launched for the first time a new fellowship program, and that fellowship program is targeted specifically for those who identify as domestic people of color. So it's an all-person of color fellowship program for students from across, in this case, 14 of our different graduate programs. And so we're committed at the New School not just to the idea that entrepreneurship is not necessarily about an individual, but we're also committed to a team-based, diverse-based, culturally inclusive approach to the notions of all the entrepreneurship work that we do. So with that, I'll close by saying thank you for joining us at the New School. We hope to see you again during our centennial celebration, and I know that the work that you're going to discuss here tonight is going to make a difference. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you, New School, for hosting us here. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Constance Frisson. I'm Ashoka's Executive Director here in North America. A few words just on my background. I've been with Ashoka for many, many years, for 15 plus years. I launched Ashoka in Germany and in Western Europe, and then moved to the US 4 years ago to take on this role. So I came in interesting times, or I came in times that proved to be really interesting and heated and dense. And I have the, lucky position that I can see the country through a lens of solutions. So it's a very hopeful role that we are having. And we want to bring some of this positive spirit, this innovation focus, this feeling that there is light at the end of the tunnel to you tonight. We have over 250 Ashoka Fellows in the United States. And you can imagine that is a pool of knowledge, of wisdom, of insights. And over the last few months, we have hosted this tour, our first Welcome Change Tour. Today is the last stop of the first edition. And this tour features varying sets of fellows and sheds light on insights they are having in different issue areas. We were in Chicago and talked about law for all. We were in San Diego and talked about movement building. We stopped at Duke University to speak about race and racial healing. A couple of weeks ago, we were in Washington, D.C. and talked about innovations in rural America. And today, at the last stop of our first leg, we are here in New York and talk about culture change and climate change. Don't expect a panel that will talk about technological innovations in the car industry or sort of, global heads of state meetings. On the panel, you will see system hackers. You will see innovators that change the fabric of society, that change our behavior, our viewpoints, norms, how we think and see the world. They speak best to themselves, so I'm going to open the panel in a minute. One, framing in terms of how it works. We'll be having 5 speakers, each very distinct with their unique approach. So I'll be calling each of them up separately. We will speak a few minutes one-on-one to get an insights into their innovation, into their work. And then we open the panel for a larger discussion, and we'll also at one point take questions from the audience. All right, without further ado, let's open the panel and have, our littlest guest is taking a break. That's okay. I want to welcome our first speaker, Angelou Etzelo. Did I pronounce this correct? Nope. From Greening Youth Foundation in Atlanta. And Angelou, come on, let's sit down. Thank you, I'm good. So how do I pronounce your name correctly?
You have to actually pause a little bit because it's a lot of vowels. It's Etzelo.
Etzelo.
And I married into it, so yeah.
Angelou,
Sorry, James.
You are an outdoor lover. You place over 500 young people of color every year in internships and national parks. What is your favorite national park?
Ooh, that's a hard one. I would have to say the Grand Tetons. The Grand Tetons in Wyoming. And actually I have one that's more urban, but the Grand Tetons is amazing to me because I don't know how many have been there, but when you're going around that curve on that road and you see these majestic mountains, it really is it's like a spiritual connection that you feel when you see these mountains. It's absolutely beautiful.
When were you there the first time? Do you remember?
Probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And so we did the whole Yellowstone Grand Teton. We did a whole tour of them. And the point of the visit was to see and meet with some of our interns that we had placed at these national parks.
So the work that you do, Angelo, is relevant in this on many fronts, but it's also relevant against the background that the demographics of the environmental movement in the U.S. are very skewed, right?
Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit more about the numbers here.
Yeah, so, and that's really in large part why I even founded this organization, because as a child, I had this love for the outdoors and the environment, but for some reason, that was not a career pathway that was introduced to me, so quite frankly, as I became a young adult, I was a little annoyed and angered that, I became a lawyer, which was like the safe career, and, and nothing against lawyers, but, knowing this love for the outdoors and then later learning about careers as environmentalists and different things that you can do, I was wondering, like, why was that never something that I was exposed to? And then as I did a little bit more research, I realized that the field, I didn't look the right way for that to be a career that I would have exposure to. So, and perhaps my parents didn't feel comfortable or safe introducing me to it because they didn't see that as a field for a young Black woman, so that was something that I immediately, you talk about, disrupting, given all the issues that we're having and environmental issues at the time, is the fact that so many young people of color, young adults of color are underemployed and unemployed, and the fact that with this climate crisis, it affects communities of color, and the communities of color are the most vulnerable. It just didn't make sense that those same people weren't being engaged as activists, as the voices to work in these fields, and as well as even enjoying and recreating in these fields. So that's what I wanted to disrupt, this notion of who could be in the outdoors.
Yeah. If I'm correctly informed, only 11% of those working in environmental conservation are currently people of color.
In C-suite.
Okay.
So, but it's very, very small. It's an extremely homogeneous field.
Yeah.
And, so I've worked for Trust for Public Land and different environmental organizations and often was one of, this is like in the early 90s, only person of color, one or two. I didn't see, there was no pipeline, there was no mentors for me, and that was something that I really wanted to change.
So it's really a question also as the country shifts demographically, who is involved in stewarding our environmental movement, right? And where's the future? How do you make it sustainable?
Absolutely, yes. It's just understanding that the demographics of this country is shifting. Our vision is making sure that it reflects society, that the workforce. And that's something that we are really actively doing. And it's actually, we're partnering with federal land management agencies, not just the National Park Service, but the Forest Service, Borough Reclamation, many land management agencies, as well as NGOs and corporations working in the environmental sector.
Thank you so much. So we will pause here for a while and then come back to your work once we have everyone on the panel. With that, I would like to have our second fellow here, Brent Smith, the founder of Greenwave. This time I pronounced correctly. Brent, you grew up in a small fishing village in Newfoundland.
Yeah,
take us there. Like,
Sure.
How should I imagine it is like growing up there?
Well, my parents were draft dodgers out of Brooklyn, and during the Vietnam War, and they went to the most eastern point of all of North America, and it was like, beautiful little fishing village, fisherman's co-op, little red, yellow, green, orange houses, all painted with leftover boat paint, sold cod tongues, door to door. It was just this really idyllic world, and my heroes weren't, cowboys or astronauts, and certainly not lawyers. Let's see if we can say something about a lawyer at every person that comes up here.
We probably have quite a few in the audience.
But I know, it's fine. We love you. We love you. I have a lot of lawyers that defend me, so it's good. Have barely kept me out of jail many a time. You look out the horizon, you see a fisherman go out, and they own their own boats. They live self-directed lives. They succeed and fail on their own terms, and they have this incredible pride of having fed their country. And those are the jobs I wanted, these jobs that people write and sing songs about. And there are certain jobs like this. There, coal miners, farmers, steel workers, fishermen. And so the question for me is, in the era of climate change, how do we create jobs, the jobs with meaning that people want to have, that we'll write songs about one day?
Earlier today, we all shared a couple of hours together here in New York working, and you shared that there was a moment that was like an epiphany, like when your mindset shifted around what it means to have a future as a fisherman.
Mm-hmm. So I dropped out of high school when I was 14 and headed out to sea, fished the globe, and ended up in Alaska on the Bering Sea. It was the height of industrialized fishing. Most of my fish was going to McDonald's for their fish sandwiches, and when the cod stocks crashed back home in Newfoundland, that was around 92, I think. Biggest layoff in Canadian history, 30,000 people thrown out of work. And what that taught me was that you can build up an economy for literally hundreds of years, but if the ecology is not protected, it can be wiped out overnight, right? And it's stunning. There will be no jobs on a dead planet. And climate change is not an environmental issue for me. I don't care about birds and bees and bears. For me, it's a kitchen table issue. It's a jobs issue, and I think that was my trajectory. And from that point on, it was a path of ecological redemption, trying to figure out, okay, how do I make a living on the ocean? How do I make sure I die in my boat one day?
And that is where ocean farming comes in. Yeah. So tell us what we need to know about ocean farming. What is it? How does it work?
Yeah, so, I'm basically an underwater gardener, right? And I grow things that won't swim away and you don't have to feed. And so what that means is using the entire water column in 25 acres and growing a mix of shellfish and seaweeds. And the reason this is powerful is that, one, it's replicable. Anybody with 20 acres and a boat, $20,000, $30,000 can build a farm. It's just ropes and buoys, right? And because you don't have to feed your crops, you don't have to water, they don't take any fertilizer, it just makes it a really affordable business model. But it also makes it the most sustainable form of food production on the planet, right? Because it's zero input food. At the same time, our kelp soaks up 5 times more carbon than land-based plants. It's called the sequoia of the sea. Our oysters filter nitrogen out of the water column, rebuild reefs, function as storm surge protectors. And the last reason I think why it's relevant is that it's scalable, right? We've got what we're debating, is it 9 or 12 years till the world ends, right? And we need solutions that we can roll out fast and are scalable, but don't replicate vertically integrated sort of massive banana plantations at sea. So but according to the World Bank, if you were to take less than 5% of U.S. waters, you could create 50 million jobs by farming our method, sequester the carbon equivalent of 40 million cars and the protein equivalent of 3 trillion hamburgers. I mean, there's more U.S. water. There's more of U.S. territory below water than above, and it's amazing. The Green New Deal mentions the ocean, I think, once. Right? We're founded as a maritime nation, but we never turn around and look. And I think one of our climate solutions, and there need to be many, is going to be out at sea.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.
Thank you. We need to do a little moving right now, and there is a microphone on your table. Thank you. Paula Daniels, come to us, the founder of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. The founder of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. Before getting to know more about your work, I must confess I didn't really think much about food purchasing, definitely not from an institutional perspective. I mean, from my own food, yes. Yeah. But you are mobilizing big institutions, school districts, health district systems to purchase food differently. Mm-hmm. So before we go into that, tell us a little bit about what do we need to know? What is the problem with the way the food purchasing system currently works?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's based on an economic model. And since we're here in the new school, I'll say that our theory of change is to create a pathway to a new kind of economy that includes values of people, planet, as well as community in how the purchasing is being done. So the current issue with the food system is it's very well wired to deliver a lot of calories and to be appealing, so it has a lot of flavor, but it doesn't in many instances do much more than that, right? So it's wired for massive consumption and massive production into very processed types of food, and it leaves a lot to be desired. It feeds a lot of people, but there's a lot of places that are struggling, right? The environment's impacted. There's a lot of extraction of natural resources in the production, highly industrialized production of food. Labor is impacted, and particularly externalized, because a lot of the labor involved in food, particularly the processing of food, is not in the United States. There's an example to use fish, that a lot of salmon that is from the United States is shipped overseas to factories in Asia to be produced and then shipped back to us. So that's an example. That's cheap labor, sometimes slave labor on the other side of that food equation. And then obviously health is an impact. So how do you start changing that? So if you change the market dynamics around that, that's our theory of change that we're working with, harnessing the purchasing power of large institutions and shifting their purchasing in a value-based direction, and we have a feedback tool for them. So we have a set of standards. When they enroll in our program, they give us their information, and they buy according to the standards. They start shifting their food purchases toward value-based food to support local economies, environmental sustainability, fair labor, animal welfare, and public health.
So let's take an example. For instance, the school district of Los Angeles, which I learned through you, has purchases food at the value of $100 million per year.
About $150 million food budget a year.
Yeah, amazing. It serves 1 million meals a day.
Just about that when you start including, they have 750,000 students. They're feeding them every day.
So amazing, enormous purchasing power. So let's say in the old days, before you started working with them, let's say I figure out I need 1 million chicken nuggets for tomorrow, or let's say 3 million chicken nuggets, for next week. Yeah. So what would happen?
So what's changed since they enrolled in our program back in 2012 is they hadn't been thinking about the values that I told you about. They were mostly thinking about just delivering calories to students. And having them eat fast and move out of the cafeteria. But they started making shifts in their health, but then once they enrolled in our program, they shifted their sourcing of local food. They hadn't even thought about it. So they went from less than 10% sourcing of local food to an average of 60% of local produce in a year. And what that did is, talk about numbers, it redirected $12 million into the local food economy, and it created 150 new jobs, and that was just in a year. So they're continuing to do that, and they're building on that. So they hadn't thought about it. We gave them a way to think about it, a rubric to follow, and to rate it for them so they can see how they're doing. And now there's other school districts around the country who are doing that. We're in 15 cities around the country.
Boston and New York.
28. Boston, New York is enrolled in the program, New York schools and other departments in New York. And then Boston just adopted it. And Boston also adopted it with a policy that wrapped around, it included the school district as well as other municipal entities that purchase large amounts of food to enroll in our Good Food Purchasing program, but it added elements of racial equity, that they wanted to support racial equity along the supply chain. And we would support that in terms of, we have extra points in our system for supporting racial equity in small businesses. So they declared an intention for that, and also accountability and transparency in reporting back on how they're doing, which is a big part of it. So part of what we're trying to do is create transparency in the supply chain.
Let's briefly talk about your own background. You're from Hawaii.
Yeah.
And you
have to add a stop in that too, Hawaii. Just to follow up.
I give you a few other words in a minute. Hawaii.
You did well.
And you point out that really had an impact on you and how you relate to food.
Well, yeah, from Hawaii, and a registered Native Hawaiian in my family, goes way back in Hawaii, many generations. Actually, Daniels is my father's side of the family name, came to Hawaii in the 1850s, married Hawaiian. But Hawaii was taken over by industrial agricultural production for the sake of sugar. And when I was growing up in Hawaii, we were at peak pineapple production, I think it was, and also peak sugar at the time my dad was born. So Hawaii's vast agricultural lands, which once supported its population, which some say were close to the population has now, not quite the same, but close, before contact, were unable to feed themselves. So during the time of war in World War II, people of Hawaii were not able to feed themselves. They had to depend on what was imported for the military that were there. So Hawaii, sugar has now left, pineapples left, so Hawaii's left with these agricultural lands and looking to see how they can start recreating a localized food system so that they can be more responsive to the people, to the labor there, to the environment there, but also to support the local economies and be resilient from a climate change standpoint. Hawaii has had hurricanes hitting it more closely than ever before. Last year, a hurricane got so close to Hawaii that the governor ordered the people of Hawaii to shelter in place, and he ordered the cargo ships away from Hawaii. They were out of food from the stores in a short amount of time because of that, so because they import food. So creating a localized food system is a climate change response, in addition to having more environmentally sound food production, but being more localized is more climate resilient.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you. Now we welcome on our panel Katrina Spade, the founder of Recompose.
Hello.
Yeah, it works. So Recompose, that has to do with dying, with funerals. It refers to a new methodology of burying the body. Very new topic here on stage. So what do we need to know about recomposing and how it works?
Well, my mom came up with the name Recompose. Thanks, Mom. You're not my mom, but... and what it means is to compose again, as in music, or as in a body into soil. And so the basic concept of what I do is I developed a way to transform bodies into soil after death. It's meant to be an alternative to cremation and burial. I don't know how you all feel, but for a lot of folks, neither of those options has deep meaning, or resonates anymore.
And so cremation and burial, the topic here being climate change, what is the environmental impact of cremation and burial? Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, interestingly, I think both of those options, conventional burial, I should say, with casket and concrete grave liner and headstone, and then cremation have about the same carbon impact. Cremation is from emissions and the burning of fossil fuels, and then conventional burial is from the manufacture and transport of all of those materials and the upkeep of cemeteries. So they're about the same when it comes to their carbon impact. And so one of the things that recomposing does for the planet is allows you to avoid that carbon impact. But the other thing that's kind of cool is that the way we recompose a body is by, wrapping it in a mixture of wood chips and straw and alfalfa. And as these materials decompose, they're sequestering soil. So we're actually showing kind of a large metric ton and a third of savings per person who chooses this option.
Mm-hmm. And so when we were preparing for this panel here, you were, yourself saying, while there is a metric ton of carbon savings here, you're probably not going to solve climate change by, everyone starting to compose humans. But we talked about that there is sort of a deeper underlying shift about embracing, I think you said, your own mortality, right? And that this has something to do with how you see yourself on this planet in relation to nature, the environment, the universe.
Yeah, I'm actually not really a carbon person. I don't really understand entirely what a metric ton savings would do for the planet, if you want to know the truth. I suspect that if we all recomposed our bodies after we died, it would have less of an impact than eating oysters. But I do think there's something very powerful about re-recognizing that we are part of nature, that we are part of this planet. And one of the ways to do that is to remember that after we die, we have something to give back. And so, to me, being able to give back whatever paltry nutrients are left in my body, I think that concept has the power to actually drive change beyond the carbon impact. Yeah.
It makes you feel sort of, small as compared to what's, it gives you, I don't know the English word, but like you feel modest, I guess, right?
Interesting. And maybe comforted
Yeah.
also, which is another benefit, I hope.
So last question, how does someone like you, stumble across that topic of reinventing, the funeral industry, the way we die?
Yeah, well, I blame my kids because they were like, let's see, my littlest, I think, was about 1 when I started to think about this. And so on a daily basis was like literally growing before my very eyes. If you've seen that of like small children, they grow in front of you. And so I realized one day that I was growing at the same pace. And I'm still growing at the same pace. We're all growing at the same pace. And it made me just very, overnight conscious that I too was mortal. Plus I just turned 30, and once you turn 30, it's like mortality, here it is.
It's done.
But so actually I was in grad school for architecture. And so I used the luxury of that time and space and thinking about design to look at the funeral industry, which I could go on for about 3 hours about, but it will not. It's a fascinating industry. And found that it was completely flawed in so many ways. And also, it had so much potential. And so that's when I started looking at the question, and I found out that farmers had been composting whole cows for a long time in this country, and it was very much like a light bulb going off.
I actually have another last question. So the state of Washington just passed a bill to enable recomposing, the first state in the US, and there was large bipartisan support for that. So I was wondering, what was the argument you used with policymakers to sort of, introduce this bill? What convinced them?
Well, we started talking to lawmakers really early on in the process, and that's such a good question. I will say that we focused very much on on not just the sustainability factor, but almost more on just the freedom of you and your family choosing what happens to your body after you die. We really distilled our messaging quite a bit. And that became really the main thing. It's like, no matter who you are, no matter Republican, Democrat, like whatever you think about climate change, you want your family to be able to decide what happens to your body when you die, and that should be the case. And so that was our focus.
Thank you, Katrina.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now we welcome Molly Burhans, the founder of Goodlands. And with that, we are moving from, dying to the Catholic Church.
Memento mori.
No pun intended. Because you, Molly, you work with the Catholic Church, the world's largest private landholder, and you bring them to manage their land differently, more sustainably. So before we go into the details here, I was wondering, how did you, as a young woman, and the Catholic Church and land ownership, how did that come together?
Well, I think it's a pretty interesting story, but I might be biased because I lived it. So when I was in my early 20s, I was attending a Jesuit school and I was thinking about becoming a nun. And these nuns that I was working with, they are not the type of Catholic that you see on the front cover of the Washington Post lately. They were at the most, the peripheries of society, working with the most marginalized and forgotten people. And it was really beautiful and really moving. And I was moved to join and become a sister. But I also saw this tremendous gap in their land management, acres of forest that were underused, lots of mown lawn. I was starting my first social enterprise with a couple other social entrepreneurs in Buffalo at the time, and it was a kind of indoor circular farming system. And so I was really exposed to the beauties of regenerative agriculture and also the reuse of industrial space through that work. And I just thought, this is a great opportunity. So in my early 20s, I thought I was going to be a nun running a permaculture farm by this point. But I discovered GIS in graduate school, and I analyzed 33,000 parcels in the city of Portland, Maine.
GIS meaning?
Geographic Information Systems. And if you've ever looked down from like Google Maps, you can see so much. There's such a story about the land that you can tell, whether it's species or whether it's aspect, slope, hydrology, topography. And this all tells us a lot of cues about both the environmental potential of landscapes, and also there's a lot of data now on demographics, and that can tell us social context of properties. And I knew that the legacy of the Catholic Church, especially at this critical time, needed to be addressed through its continuing land management, its real estate management, through using data to really make high impact choices.
Let us get a feel for the size here. So how much land does the Catholic Church own?
Well, no one really knows, to be honest. We have mapped what we believe is about 92% of the properties in the United States, but every day we find out more and more oil fields, more agriculture fields, not only churches, and globally, people have been tithing land to different Catholic titles under different entities for 2,000 years. 26% of healthcare facilities globally are Catholic. It's the largest non-governmental network of aid. It's the largest non-governmental network of education, serving over 54 million students a year. And so the land holdings are just astronomical considering that. And when I was in graduate school, I asked the naive question, so they must be the largest conservation network or environmental network, and I found a huge void.
So there is a massive opportunity here. I think I read in one of your interviews that you said it's the size of France and Spain combined.
Some people have estimated that. Yeah. I'm dubious. I actually think it might be more. More.
Wow. So there was this void when you came up with a question. So how did you start to dig in? What was like your entry point here?
It's really interesting, actually. A great mentor of mine, Jill Kerr Conway, the first female president of Smith, really, I sat down with her for tea and she just pulled the idea completely out of me. And I still have a transcript of that meeting. And it was, the details and the operations have gotten obviously much more refined, but that she really gave me the courage to approach this. And I thought, of course, I would meet my people doing this already. And I was shocked to find no one in this space. So, with the state of climate change, it's like, what do you have to lose?
How much do you tap into, let's say, the faith and the value orientation of the church in order to drive your work? Is that something, let's say, you bring up with the Pope, or how can we imagine you do that?
Well, it definitely drives most of our work at its heart. And I think Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si has been so universally recognized as one of the most important documents, I would say, of this century. And that really brought in this view of an integral ecology, which I think transcends just Catholicism. It goes across cultures. It talks about the ecological conversion and this change of heart that causes the change in behavior for all of us to address climate change. So that really draws it. And of course, when he talks about hearing the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, that's really important for us. On this panel, you'll hear people talking about, how tied social justice and social well-being is to the planet. And I really think that to be a respectful, good kind of life, you have to care and steward for this amazing planet we've been given.
Thank you. And that is a great segue now into, I want to open the panel here up for more discussion. So we have been, talking a lot about the incentive structure, and I'm hearing the full spectrum. I'm hearing Bren say, exaggerated, like, I don't care about birds and polar bears, I care about jobs. So there is this economic incentive.
He loves birds. I know he does.
Then we have here Molly, on the other hand, tapping into, deeply rooted sort of faith base. And I imagine you, Angelo, you must run against the establishment all the time. So what is your, let's just talk about that for a moment. What is your experience with, how do you bring people on board? Is it belief? Is it culture? Is it jobs? Is it all of that? Let's hear.
I've found that I feel like I'm in a little bit of a special position because so many people are not pleased with the options at the end of life. And I think culturally it's been over the past 150 years or so, we've seen kind of a partnership of the funeral industry wanting us, the people, to keep death at arm's length, because it just makes their jobs easier if we're not asking a bunch of questions and trying to change things all the time. And we, the people, saying, oh, okay, I don't really want to think about it very much. But that tide is starting to turn, and so, again, I've found many people disappointed with the way the end of life went for their loved ones. And so we're starting at a place of not having to convince, but rather just having the opportunity to offer a new option.
And Angelou, in your case, like, how does, let's say, the establishment react to your work?
I mean, I think in our case at Greening Youth Foundation, what we're finding is that a whole segment of our demographic of society has been left out of a movement. And in light of what's happening with climate change and such a dire need for workforce in different fields across the sector, which is extremely homogeneous, there's this, I think, two issues going on, like an issue of needing to reach out to a new workforce, but at the same time, being very comfortable with the current culture and the way things are and the way they've always been. So yes, to your point, I mean, at times it's met with a lot of friction. And we're having to deal with, although we're getting these young people and young adults ready to go into these different environments, the institutions they haven't done their work, and they're not exactly ready. And it's causing, in some cases, kind of like all the work that we're doing with them to completely be reversed. So there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. Paula?
In our case, it actually started with political will, which is driven by public will. So we started this as a program of the Office of Mayor Virgoso of Los Angeles, wanted to make some changes in the food system and see what cities could do to help influence the food system in the region. So we developed this program through a large process of stakeholder input. So there was a lot of public will, political will that was reflected in the program. And then the accountability component was the adoption of the program by the LA Unified School District School Board. So it was a lot of translating what everyone wanted into this program and making it available. And since then, it has spread by word of mouth. We haven't had to so-called market. People have heard about it, folks have heard about it and want to do it. And what I'm seeing is that these institutions, the school districts, the food service providers at these large institutions want to do more. They know that something needs to change, and what we're giving them is a tool. We're giving them a feedback tool. We're giving them a way to communicate their story. We're giving them technical assistance, and they're all ready to do it. They're still working through some of the constraints they have, right, which are bureaucratically driven and not of their making, but they want that opportunity. I have a lot of faith in the people in these large institutions to try to do more. I think we just have to give them the room and the opportunity.
And do you need to come with numbers and say, look, you'll be saving that much or that much if you pursue the more sustainable route, or is that not really a question you're
It depends on the school district as to how they manage it, but it doesn't have to cost them more to do this route, for one. I want to mention that. But if they do follow a path, it's an option for them. They don't have to, but if they follow a path of meat reduction, they can save a lot. So if they have more plant-forward food, those sorts of things, it's an option for them to do that. But there's ways to do that as well. Mostly they're doing it because they understand that more needs to be done, that the food system they're purchasing needs to reflect their values. It doesn't, and it could, and it should, and if they have an opportunity to do it, they, by and large, are ready to do it, which is really encouraging.
And Vern, are your fishermen or your ocean farmers, do they self-identify as climate savers or as environmentalists?
Well, I mean, when I started growing seaweed, it was just the most embarrassing thing I'd ever done in the ocean. I used to tell people on the docks that I was growing hemp, actually, just so I didn't get beat up. But What's interesting is, the demand's been huge. I think it's because people see the ocean as a blank slate, and this idea that we can build an economy from the bottom up and kind of do food right, do agriculture right this time, weave social justice into the DNA of the economy, make sure beginning farmers have access, things like that. We have requests to start farms in every coastal state in North America, 20 countries around the world. But what's fascinating, it was supposed to be sort of grumpy fishermen with criminal records like me. And instead, we stepped back 2 years ago and looked at who's in the industry, and it was mostly women, which is fascinating. So there's Catherine Puckett in Block Island, for example, who grows oysters, clams, and kelp. And she has a pink boat. And all male crew who love their jobs because they don't have to leave island in the off season because kelp's a winter crop, but they hate working on a pink boat. Right? And so, the prospect that this could be one of the first, the blue economy could be one of the first economies that women are actually architects of. It's not an equity issue. They actually shape and what it might look different. It's just been a fascinating prospect.
Talking about men and women, so if you are a woman in a world of men, how does that play out?
It's actually quite interesting. When I was 26 years old, I found myself sitting in the Secretary of State's office in the Vatican looking for a data set. And it was one of the most beautiful halls I'd ever seen, all these wonderful frescoes. And to my shock, they hadn't really had a map update since the Holy Roman Empire. So I had a great team at my disposal, and we made the first comprehensive global map of the Catholic Church in history. I found that it's shockingly, I've been welcomed. I don't know why. I keep waiting for me to for someone. I've only been yelled at once in the Vatican by a lower ranking priest. So it's been really actually exciting to see that. And I don't think this would have ever happened in the Catholic Church, even a decade ago. And I think a lot of people have paved the way for a young woman with a lot of really important information and a really important approach to be there. I think one of the biggest things going for me is that this is a crisis of real estate, and we aren't really talking about it. And it's not just in the Catholic Church, it's in other religious institutions and institutions that are seeing decreasing numbers in some parts of the world. So, the value is there, and it somehow outpaces, I guess, my gender. But I think the biggest thing in the Catholic world that I've seen isn't actually in the hierarchical leadership. The trouble is in a lot of times the funding structures aren't there to support women because there's this idea that we're servants, more from a slave perspective than servants as in, leader servants.
And one question here. So the Catholic Church, you were sort of speaking earlier around sort of the, faith and ideological reasons that you come up and intervene with, or sort of the potential faith you're tapping into as a source of motivation. Aren't there also very mundane reasons, when we're looking at refugees, for instance, or at, sort of hunger or political violence, that, the Catholic Church should step up managing their land wisely?
Exactly. I mean, it's such an amazing model. I think the UN has been interested in this, some people there in the Commonwealth, because it shows a large non-state actor with a distributed network of land that can do a lot of good for not only migration, but, impacting climate change, which is why we partially take a triple bottom line approach to really understand the potential of properties. One of the kind of jurisdictional maps that we made, we recently showed where the Catholic Church is the most powerful non-state actor for addressing biodiversity. So these are places with fragile states, with a lot of Catholics, and really high biodiversity and a lot of development pressures. So even something that simple can show where this is a really powerful non-state actor that operates in a really interesting meta-state governance type of way.
So another question to all of you, who are the unlikely allies you are encountering in your work? Just the fact that we are here on the panel sitting with someone who works in food and fishermen on sort of bringing social justice into the environmental movement, dying, the Catholic Church. I mean, that's not what comes up when you say climate change at the kitchen table, right? So I'm wondering, did you encounter any unlikely allies in your work?
I would say local food economies resonates on a number of levels with a number of different sectors. Supporting the local food economies and smaller businesses, smallholder businesses in a community is something that I would just say is deeply resonant. And I wouldn't say the allies were surprising, though. I mean, it's something we are finding affirmation that there's almost universal support for it. It's just a question now of reworking the economies because it's very favored toward globalism. But so getting a percentage at least of the economy in local, and the way I like to think of it is like we have a percentage in renewable energy, right? The systems were once dependent on fossil fuels. We can do it the way renewable energy was built up, but it's received broader support than we even imagined.
One of my favorite things is about this work is just that the experts and allies just come out of the woodwork, and it's just it's fascinating. I often find I don't know who I need until they arrive, and then I have no idea how I was doing the work before they were with me, you know. But I think the funeral industry is really interesting. I kind of want to fast forward to 5 years from now when you ask the same question of me and see if my answer is the funeral industry, because I started the work thinking like, that's the bad industry. There's a lot of problems with that industry, no doubt. But in part because there's such consumer desire for something new. I think the industry is saying like, yeah, we want to offer something new, but kind of looking around like, what is that? And so I am finding that the more I talk with folks who are running funeral homes and giving the typical options, the more it starts like, if I can figure out a way to offer this to them, then it may be a good fit. So I think that's an interesting allyship.
You know what I like about Katrina's model, though, is that it really respects the cycle of life in a complete way, which is something, you know, we'd been a bit disassociated from, and our food system had been disassociated from, became more linear. And the more we respect how it all cycles around, I think the more whole our approach is to things. So it's a fascinating model.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because then the question is, it almost begs the question of adjusting the current linear model, which it might be what it means if what Recompose does is help the funeral industry on its current path, or is it really rethinking what it means to die, what it means to eat, what it means to buy food? And so, but I think it's a good question, because sometimes allies can keep us on a path that maybe it would be better to like completely break from. I don't know the answer, but yeah.
I just wanted to your model. I agree. It's just really fascinating, but I wondered, kind of like with the work that we do, embedded in it is race and the discussion of race. And sometimes it's, hard to get to the issue that I want folks to talk about because they don't want to really deal with race. I wonder, do you struggle sometimes because people don't want to talk about death and dying? So do you find that people are uncomfortable with it and therefore you can't get to that next level of discussion?
I think as much as that is true, there's also this power in when people start to talk about death. It's empowering, and you might have to do that because you just lost someone you love, and so it's not always a good empowering, and sometimes that doesn't empower us, obviously, but whether it's because we're grieving or because we've suddenly decided that thinking about our own mortality gives us something, and I guess there's something offered through that. And then I guess, but yes, I mean, we have to get through that barrier before we're going to change anything, for sure.
And Angelou, how do you deal with that? Like the issue you just surfaced, like
dying?
The race.
The race question. Yeah. I mean, it's always the pink elephant in the room, honestly. I mean, as I said earlier in our discussions, it's like, unless we get to a point where we can openly talk about race, so many issues that are and problems that we are dealing with in society, go back to that, So I find that I have no issue. I'm very comfortable talking about race and So I often put it out there so that, so that people can just talk about it, because when you look at the issue that we deal with, because I deal with the intersection of the environmental, the homogeneity of the environmental sector, but how young people of color are, their unemployment rates are so high, so why is, to me, it's a duh moment as to why these young people aren't, and so much is needed in this environmental sector. So there's a big gap, there's this like abyss of questions that I have. So, I often just put it out there and go directly through it. And I find that that's helping, so I just feel that I'm really, really hopeful. I'm and call me the optimist, my husband always says that, but, now that people are exposed and, have access, like they're really excited about it, and, all this innovation is being brought to the table. So, I think that the urgency of now is creating opportunities. So that's one way of looking at it that I choose to look at, because I don't want to get into there's 10 years remaining, 12 years, you know what I mean? Like, let's work on what the solutions can be, and collaboratively together, what can we work on?
And are you seeing that there is an awareness shift, let's say, on the, established side of the table, that, let's say, the white-dominated part of the environmental movement is realizing what they gain from shifting the system?
It's a slow shift. It's a slow shift. I mean, I think, as I said earlier, power needs to be conceded, and a lot of changes have to happen. There needs to be. I often say that now it's not just a matter of who is at the table, but it's really how many are at the table, and maybe new tables being built, and you know what I mean. So it's the whole paradigm is being shifted, and it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. It's uncomfortable for people who have always done the same things for decades and have always been in positions of power. So I think that change is inevitable, but it is going to be, it's slow. It's slow, but it's happening.
I will be opening the room for questions in just a few minutes, so you can start thinking about it. In the meantime, I have another question for Bren, sort of taking up this issue of, this timing, the issue of timing. So if we hear it's slow, but it's changing. We were talking before about the sense of urgency. How do you see that come together with the segment of the population you work with?
I got into this because I was hit by Sandy and Irene. I became an oysterman, and then 2 hurricanes came in and wiped me out. And that was a moment of adaptation, of realizing this is not a slow lobster boil, but it's a here and now. And I was one of the canaries in the coal mine for a climate crisis that arrived 100 years earlier than expected. But I look back at that moment when I was getting dragged off the rocks by the Coast Guard, and it was actually the most creative moment in my life, right? Where, our back's against the wall and humans do kind of cool things, right? And I think the timing, I'm becoming more enamored with bundles of solutions, right? There are thousands of us out there, whether white collar or blue collar innovators. And it's not about sort of picking the bright new shiny thing. It's about all of us out there trying to address climate change in thousands of different ways, and that's really where my hope comes from.
Thank you.
I just want to make a note about timing too. I think there is this incredible urgency that we have, but really the hope that comes with it too. Just being part of Ashoka, being here and hearing all these climate solutions amongst this backdrop of just doom and gloom is so uplifting. And it's in the Catholic Church, there's also this critical timing where it's like, why would you jump and do this now? But it's really, you see, Detroit Archdiocese has, over 200 properties up for sale. Canada just released a report that over 9,000 churches they expect to close. And these trends, even though they seem quite devastating, there's so many opportunities. Imagine if we could continue our legacy through environmental stewardship on the properties that have a lot of land to that, or affordable housing, these crises that we're all facing more and more each day. There are solutions kind of hiding everywhere, I think.
Thank you. Let's see whether there are any questions from the audience or online.
Question right here. Thank you so much. Question for all of you. I'd love to hear some of the challenges that you're facing, perhaps preferably the biggest challenge. If you could wave a magic wand and one problem would instantly disappear, which would you pick and why?
Thank you. Let's take one or two more, if there's another one.
Hi, my question is for Katrina. I'm curious what role religion plays in different burial traditions in your work so far.
Sorry, mine's also going to be for Katrina, so is that going to be okay if I still ask that? Okay, perfect. I'm Deb, and I'm actually going to be opening the first 100% green and eco-friendly cemetery in Rochester, New York. And thank you. It's wonderful. It's a big deal. But I just want to know what steps we would need to do to make Recompose legalized in New York.
Thank you. Cool. All right, and one more there. And let's see.
Hi, I'm a designer, and I think designers can help solve some of these issues. So I was wondering if you could share a bit more of how do you think design can serve better some of these urgent issues and complex challenges that we're facing. Thank you.
So I pause here for a second, or we will forget the questions that were asked. Let's start with the challenge questions, the challenge that you would want to go away. Brian.
I think the challenge for me is the sharks have arrived. The sharks of Wall Street. Some are real sharks. Some are fuzzy sharks, also known as impact investors. And the question is, are they see the ocean and they're like, oh my God, there's trillions of money to be made. We can grow not only food, but we can use the seaweeds for fertilizer, for animal feed. We can use it for bioplastics. And they want to take an old economy model and move it out to sea. And we see a future of networked production, right? 50 small-scale farms, a hatchery, a seafood hub, and rings of entrepreneurs, and then replicating what we think of as green wave reefs up and down the coast, and making sure that the benefits don't concentrate at the top. That keeps me up. How are we going to address that? And how is the food movement? We're going to go out and see, and we farm it every day. Who's going to defend our land from privatization? Who's going to make sure that we can afford leases? Who makes sure that we own the infrastructure? Right here in New York, we're working with the Hope Alliance to build a fertilizer plant, worker-owned by formerly incarcerated folks. How do we compete with the fertilizer, industry? So I don't know who asked it, but that's what keeps me up.
That ties into what I was going to say. And, I would say we do want to build supply chains from your food to the school districts. There's a barrier here, and that the school districts and a lot of the municipal institutions have very little to pay for food. So the big question here is the cost of food. Does the cost of food really reflect what it takes to produce it? And in Bren's case, what he sells will be the true cost of the food, but a lot of the other food, right, the highly commoditized food is subsidized in a number of ways, and the negative externalities, very wonky term, but the impacts of the food are not borne in the cost of the transaction of the food, right? So sugar, for example, creates a lot of public health problems, negative externality. The medical system takes care of that. We pay for the medical system, but it's not reflected in the 99 cents for the beverage. So getting more dollars directed toward better food. So for school districts, a lot of them, LAUSD, did what they did without increasing their food spend, but spending $2.70 per meal. That's all they're allocated through the federal school lunch program. What if they got more? And then they could add in organic, and then they could add in seafood. If they could add in a lot of other stuff. In France, I think they get more per meal in school districts. So shifting our relationship to the cost of food and having a true cost of food reflected, but also more money for school districts, and that's coming through places like Michigan that have 10 cents per meal that they're adding to schools to do more. I think that would make a big difference.
I'm going to talk about the fuzzy sharks for a moment with one of our biggest challenges. It's what we've seen in impact investment is really this awesome transition of people realizing that their money is changing the world and making sure that it's going to serve the right places, or at least try to look like it. And I think the larger picture of Goodlands is well beyond the Catholic Church. What we're talking about is anyone that owns a lot of land. We've been approached by evangelicals, even Buddhists at this point, and we're trying to grapple with kind of the branding of how to serve all these people, kind of like Catholic healthcare serves everyone. So there is kind of a scalability there, but really what's underneath that all is this new kind of systems view of real estate. And a recognition, like an impact investment, that all of our properties are changing the world. They're impacting, everything around them. They're impacting communities and ecosystems, and having people really gain that view, that holistic view of the land that they own and the ability of that land to change the world is a major shift that we're up against.
I would have to say resources particularly for our Urban Youth Corps program. This is our program where we're working with very challenging young people coming from very challenging backgrounds, and often the model that we have, which is fee for service, is very sustainable. However, this particular program requires us to really engage young people longer than a specific project length. And I find that a lot of our partners or people who are interested in working with these young people, they think that they could just come in and have them work on a project and then that's it, and their lives are forever changed. And it really takes much more than that. So it needs to be more of a sustained engagement, which of course takes more dollars. So that's probably one of the things, if I could have a wand to fix, that's what it would be.
Dollars. Should I just answer the other questions?
No, why don't you briefly weigh in? On the question of the challenge?
I used to think this idea was a niche idea that people wouldn't. Well, my parents loved it, but and maybe hippies or something. But it turns out that there are lots of people around the world that do want this option. And my challenge is how to get it everywhere, which is, I guess, a great problem to have. It's a nice sign that I don't have to work too hard to try to change people's desires. I can just try to get them what they need. So,
thank you. I would suggest, in the interest of time, that perhaps on the question of what do we need to do here, you follow up one-on-one, and you shed some light on the answer on the question, though, the role of religion that you're seeing.
Today, right now? Mm-hmm. Well, actually, it's not too long. When there's, believe it or not, a lot of disposition customs are not driven by religion. A lot of religions don't have a particular way that you care for a body after death. Some do, but some don't. And so when we had our bill up at the Washington State Senate, we actually had dozens of religious leaders write letters of support for this option, because many of them are concerned about climate change, and so they were looking at this as a sustainability issue. I could get more into the religious stuff with you after, but in general, I'd say it's surprising how few religions prescribe a particular way of death care.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay. Good evening. As we all know that climate change is not an issue just limited to United States of America, but it's a global issue. Yes. And we have to focus on all the elements of globally where fossil fuel is and where we are doing other things. I have 2 questions for Bren and Ms. Paula. How do you think that, Paula, first that by local food in the schools, you are helping the economy or the global change, because what I saw that president had to announce $20 billion to the soya industry in Midwest because they cannot export it anymore to China. So now the localization is very good point, but how it deals with the global issue, which is again going to trigger.
Could I ask you to be short and precise because we are running out of time.
Okay. Paris and Kyoto deal. And for Bren, you took the question very well about the employment. Where the environment is not a challenge to direct employment, for example, banks are cutting on human employment and placing such ATMs which can do everything for you, and that is also reducing, but it has nothing to do with environment. How you tackle, because the question we have very less time. Can you answer that, please?
Yes. Oh, and we forgot the
and
design
one more
question.
right here in the middle.
We are
Here.
unfortunately we have what we could do is we could we say goodbye to the folks on the live stream and then continue a little bit here. We have you and then someone, David in the first row. I will. Yeah. The gentleman. Hi, Mom.
On the flip side, climate change could also affect menstrual periods. And my question is to Molly and Angelo, especially for Americans of color, to how much more can we look at interventions for seeing how we can assess eco-friendly paths to supporting underserved girls who do not even have a chance? Because basically some stable climate, especially in California, can affect your periods, and especially when they don't have the chance to be able to access these eco-friendly paths. How do we look into such intervention, working with the Catholic Church and Americans of color? Thank you.
Let's see whether we have an answer to that one. David? Just,
For a question for Angelou, as the leadership changes in the environmental movement over time and it's less homogenous, how do you see the priorities shifting? What are the sorts of things that you would like to see more on the table in terms of core priorities that perhaps aren't now?
Okay, let's start with this one.
Yes, thank you for that question, because there's so many things that we should be focusing on, like the innovation and, school systems and having curriculum that actually starts very young, introducing young people to the different career pathways, because I kind of like when, I guess years ago when SHOP was in school and, different career pathways were introduced in trades and so forth. We need to start doing that again at the high school level. And I just think that our focus has really shifted away from some of these types of solutions because of the administration and us being afraid of saying even certain words. So I think that there's a lot that can be done and focus changed, and hopefully with the new administration we can work more on that.
Do you want to answer the gentleman's question?
Yeah, I think this will answer it, but I'm not positive. First, there are hundreds of types of shellfish and 10,000 plants in the ocean. There's something we can grow everywhere. I mean, imagine being a chef and finding out there's like arugulas, kales, carrots, out there that you've never cooked with or tasted with before. So we can farm on this basic sort of underwater scaffolding system anywhere. I think the future, and we're doing this now, which is not just concentrating on food, but our farmers in 4 states right now are getting paid to harvest data, so they get $25,000 just to have sensors on their farm and be data harvesters. And then we're developing carbon, methane, and nitrogen credit systems, right? So, for example, you feed cattle a 2% diet of Asparagopsis seaweed, you get a 58% reduction in methane output. It's stunning. Well, farmers should get the benefit of that. So the farm in the future is harvesting food, harvesting data, and harvesting ecosystem services, and diversifying risk, growing many species in one area, and I think that gives you climate resiliency.
I do want to answer your question about how we impact climate change. So our standards are, if you think of like how LEED certification works for buildings, they have a number of different categories that the building owner can comply with. We have a similar set of standards. There's a baseline metric for each. So one is local economies, but another is environmental sustainability, another is fair labor, another is animal welfare, and another is nutritional health. So in the environmental sustainability category, we're directing purchases and we reflect back to the institution how their purchases are supporting the environment. Specifically to your question about climate change, though. So local economies, one could argue that that might have an impact on climate change, but we also have a category of meatless Mondays. So reducing meat toward more plant-based purchasing. You probably know this, but the single biggest thing you could do as a consumer of food in your choices is if you reduced meat consumption, meat from factory farms, you'd be making a huge impact on the environment because that creates a lot. Bren touched on one of those aspects. Obviously, depending on how the meat is raised, it could also, and that's where animal welfare comes in, it could also be an answer. So grazing cattle, soil health, that can help. So we direct purchases in that direction, and we've seen climate impacts in a positive direction from the improvements that the large institutions are making.
Can I just quickly respond to one gentleman when he asked what can communities of color do? I just get involved. Like volunteer, become active. You don't necessarily have to have a job working in the environmental sector, but so long as the lens that you use for whatever work you do is through a lens of sustainability, I think that that's going to help everyone in the long run. So I just think getting involved is key.
And I'm going to answer your question. I think biological cycles aren't really the question here when we're talking about fertility in the future. The question is the psychological impact of climate change, the community impact of climate change, of migration that's caused by that. And what we're seeing is more and more young women, families making the choice to not have kids because they're really afraid of the future and what that brings for them. And it's going to be impossible to raise a family if you're, migrating and escaping deadly heat waves that are coming every year or a crop that doesn't grow. So the future of really the world and humanity and families themselves really depends on taking care of the planet. And I think that the bigger issue here is much more of the whole system's impact that it has on the communities that we have.
Thank you all. With that being said, we'll have to wrap up. I want to thank the audience, and I want to thank you, first and foremost, for a fascinating panel. There's now time to mingle, to address the design question that we left out, the funeral question. There's wine, there's snacks. Come and join us and be merry. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.